Hey everyone, welcome to 3 Beers Deep. It is Monday, May 18th. I almost said June 18th, and even though the year is flying by awfully quick, we are not quite June yet, although it kind of feels like June. In Chicago, the weather has warmed up considerably to the point where I actually have to put on the AC, consider putting on the AC, turning off the AC because I don't want to pay for the AC, but then also remembering, hey, 2 weeks ago you were complaining that you had to put on like a jacket because we were still dipping into the early 40s. So it's nice, but then there's a new thing to complain about. So this is my weekly Q&A show in which you ask me questions over at patrickklepek.tumblr.com. Answer questions there daily and then pluck from those for my weekly show here at 3 Beers Deep. It's going to be a shorter show, but I say that every time, and we always go about 15 to 20 minutes. So let's get started. Straight to your questions. Before I do that, though, take a sip of this coffee. Delicious, because it is the morning, actually, so I can drink coffee instead of just drinking water. Anonymous asks, do you think developers view games in a different way than the press or public, so that it is difficult for them to understand some of the flaws and bugs? Do you think the developers view games in a different way than the press or public? That is, they understand how difficult some of the flaws or bugs can be to fix and can overlook them to see the bigger picture, concept and design of the game when developing their opinion of it. Yeah, I think one of the things that makes that abundantly clear is when we have these questions about graphical downgrades. There's currently one happening right now with The Witcher 3. There was a conversation about Watch Dogs. There was a conversation about Dark Souls 2. This seems to come up every 6 months or so. There's a new game in which the version that ships looks markedly different, or at least somewhat different, than the version that was shown off publicly in trailers or demos or to the press, and the version that's shipping looks worse. Of course, you know what the term "worse" even means is entirely subjective. So let's talk about what that means and kind of unpack that a little bit. I think what's interesting, or what's difficult for developers, is they are showing early versions of a game in which they are often showing it running on a high-end PC in the most ideal environment. And then what happens is that the game has to ship. And what happens when the game has to ship is that compromises have to be made in a variety of areas. And so let's take The Witcher, for example. Now, The Witcher is a game that was explicitly made this time around with consoles in mind. They knew when they conceived The Witcher 3, it was going to come out on the PC, the Xbox One, and the PlayStation 4. With The Witcher 2, they may have had aspirations to come out on Xbox 360, but they were forced to port that game and make that game work in a way that wasn't affected by the PC development. The console version was a completely autonomous entity in which the developers at CD Projekt Red were confronted with a way of having to transform a game that never was considered for consoles in the first place. And The Witcher 3 was a game that eventually was going to have to ship on consoles. And you're talking about the Xbox One and PS4, of which there are some subtle hardware differences, enough so that, relatively common, we find that games run at a slightly lower resolution on the Xbox One versus the PlayStation 4. So you take into account those three different hardware configurations, one of which is changing the PC, where people can kind of just throw more stuff at it, whereas on the console you have sort of a strict architecture, and those both have advantages and disadvantages. And I can understand why a developer would end up showing off what they aspirationally hope the game is going to be, right? They're going to show Witcher 3 in the most positive light, the best version of the game, the one that's running on the highest end hardware, and it looks gorgeous, but then when the rubber meets the road, when they've got to make it run on ordinary PCs, when they've got to make it run on consoles, that there are compromises made that end up making the game look different, or as is often used as the case, worse. And I think this is an instance in which the developer would probably argue, and I think this is what CD Projekt Red has argued when they've talked about this briefly, is that when you ship a game, you have to make certain compromises in order to ship the game. And for consumers, I understand their anger as well. When they saw a game that looked better, now it looks worse. Why does it look worse? And then the easy scapegoat is that, they're putting it out on consoles. This is all the console's fault. I don't know if that's necessarily true. We'll never know. I think it can be a factor. I would not doubt that the game is altered or designed in certain ways so it could accommodate a console architecture that doesn't scale in the same way the PC stuff does. That said, is it also understandable that a game is going to be different before it's released and after it's released? It is. Is it also understandable that people would be upset that they feel like they were sold something different or pre-ordered something different, and then when it's shipping, the version that they were going to play, well, it looks a bit different. It looks a bit worse. Those are all things that I think are legitimate gripes from all sides. And I mean, I looked at a video for The Witcher 3 that was like low detail, high detail, and absolutely the low detail version looks worse, but I mean, it's still an unbelievably gorgeous game, even at low detail. And I think, if we're to revisit some of the eye rolling that sometimes happens amongst the press, and I think sometimes I understand why they do it, and I'm certainly complicit in that, and I think other times I don't understand why they do it, is maybe it's the press understanding, yeah, these compromises happen. Sometimes the games look a little worse when they ship, but, them's the breaks, and also the game looks pretty great. And that's different than, for example, like Dark Souls 2, a game that looked as though they had ripped out an entire lighting engine that made the game look substantially different in the shipping product. There are different versions of this story that get told. And I think it's a complicated question that isn't as simple as they downgraded it, because CD Projekt Red is a studio that takes their games really, really seriously. They take their players really, really seriously. And this may be a case in which, to appeal to a broader base, to be a more ambitious studio, they maybe had to make some cuts to ship the game. The game has obviously been delayed several times. Maybe that stuff's linked to it. Maybe in order to get the game shipping out the door and not delaying it to the fall yet again, they had to make some compromises. And so for that to get sort of condensed into an Imager post that is just like, look what this game looked like and look what it looks like now. I imagine that's frustrating for developers and that's frustrating for consumers. Both sides feel like they don't see eye to eye on it, and then sometimes the press rolls their eyes at the whole thing, which doesn't help matters. So, as a long-winded way of answering that question, but good question. Anonymous asks, I'll give it to you straight. I've got a half full bathtub and a bucket full of ginger ale. No questions asked. Let's have some fun. Send me a private message on Tumblr. Giant Bomb Duder, you watching Penny Dreadful, man? You should watch Penny Dreadful, man. To show on Showtime. I think it's got like historical horror figures or something like that. I've heard just okay things about Penny Dreadful, and I'm kind of chock full of shows that I need to be watching right now. I'm watching Lost again for the podcast that I do. We're just finishing up Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Mad Men just went off the air. A lot of my shows are about to take a break, which is actually kind of good. So now it means I can watch. The summer is usually a time when I watch shows that I meant to catch up on. I need to watch the 5th and 6th seasons of Justified. So, I guess, I don't know. Penny Dreadful just doesn't look that interesting. Conceptually, I should be super into it. But the trailers I watched, the write-ups that I read about it, it just didn't really do anything for me. I'm glad you're enjoying it, though. Maybe I'll get around to it eventually. Delarat says, you spitting in your brother's eye isn't so bad. This is a story I told in which I spat in my brother's eye from the upper bunk, and I meant to just spit him in the face, but hit him right in the eye. It was very traumatic. He still complains about it to this day. Delarat says, my brother used to pin me down and let a loogie dangle as close to my eyes as he could get it until it broke off once and landed in my mouth. Younger brothers are meant to suffer. Wow, that's victim blaming, Delarat. That's victim blaming. You don't have to be okay with that. Though I guess you have to be okay with that. Let a loogie dangle as close to your eyes as you could get until it broke off and landed in my mouth. That is... Wow, one time I peed on my brother, so... Double Cross Ranch. Has there ever been a true red herring horror game? I know stuff like Inversion has done the twist, but I'm talking like Farming Simulator or Woodcutting Simulator, titled as such. There turns out to be a Texas Chainsaw Victim Simulator simulation 3 hours in. I don't think so. I mean, I think for a long time people were thinking that Gone Home was going to be a bait and switch, in that, Steve Gaynor and the Fulbright Company were saying it's not a horror game. It's not a horror game, even though they were absolutely playing upon the trope of horror games to offset your expectations in a way that made the game tense without actually having to be tense in the way horror games sometimes are. Excuse me. But the idea that someone would sell something called like Wood Chip Simulator 3 and then it turns into a horror game halfway through, I mean, that would take some serious cojones, especially because you're how do you do, like, as soon as someone figures it out, it's not really a bait and switch anymore. But the idea, if we take this kind of into more realistic terms, a game that conveys itself as one type of game and then becomes a different type of game, that sounds really exciting. But I think the problem is that when people feel as though they like, is the bait and switch fun, or is the bait and switch going to make people angry? We were just talking about what some people consider a bait and switch with the way graphics are conveyed between pre-release and the release product. So if someone did something like that, would that be funny, or would that just make a bunch of people angry that were like pretty interested in Wood Chip Simulator 3 because the second one was kind of disappointing and they were a little too ambitious, and the third one kind of scales it back and really just gets back to what people liked about the first one, which is wood chipping. I don't know, but I like your idea. I think it might be something maybe good for mod communities and things like that, but I like conceptually where you're going with it. The Subtle Doctor. Pat, you are a man familiar with the grieving process as you have experienced significant loss. As a person who has lost an infant daughter, I'm so sorry. I am also no stranger to grief. It took me 2 years to come to something resembling acceptance, though I still struggle. This is a very personal question, but with July close, I was wondering if you had made peace with your losses. What helps you cope? The fact that you have addressed this issue in the past has positively impacted my life. Keep fighting. Well, that's incredibly kind of you to say. Part of the reason I do talk about this stuff is because I believe people tend to keep that stuff internalized in a way that isn't healthy, and that it's okay to talk about the grieving process, and it's okay to talk about having good days and bad days, and it's okay to talk about being angry and upset and still missing people years on, when I think we paint a narrative that you just get over things, and that just doesn't happen. You live with these things for the rest of your life. I think the one thing that's different is 3 years in, or almost 3 years into my dad having passed, is that I don't think about him every day. And I wrote about that last year, in which it's a good thing and a bad thing. It allows me to get through the days a little bit easier. I don't find myself just getting spontaneously upset nearly as much anymore. But it also means that I've forgotten him a little bit, and that makes me upset. There's a cycle there that is kind of frustrating, in which you lose people, move on from them in some way, and then it's sad that you're moving on because you don't have new memories to make. And so I think, the way I cope, generally speaking, if I kind of take a sort of holistic, big picture approach, is that I try and make those people proud. I try and do the things that I think those people would tell me to do, and I try and honor my experiences with them. Whether it's my father, whether it's my colleague Ryan Davis. It's like, what would Ryan Davis do? Ryan Davis would buy the Fast and Furious series, catch up on it, and defend Tokyo Drift. And so that's what I did. With my father, it's, moving closer to home, being around family, being there for people when they need you. There was an incident with my family last week in which I got to make good on that. It's the whole reason that I wanted to be closer to home. And I think it's a matter of finding ways to remember people in different ways, and for me, that's honoring how they would have wanted me to live my life and doing that to the fullest, and realizing that life is fragile and taking that into account into all of your actions, and making good on what you want to do in a way that maybe I didn't do so much before, but that I try to do so now. So complicated question. I'm sure I'll be thinking and talking about it more as we get closer to July, and the feelings around those things get closer. Yeah, I hope you are doing well, the Subtle Doctor. That is a tragic loss that you suffered, and I'm very sorry for you. Dak Hoofer says, "Hey Patrick, question for the next 3 beers deep. I've started Lost, and 8 episodes in, I already love it. Well, I have an idea of what happens in the overall story arc. I'm going in relatively blind, so I was wondering if you have any tips or advice for people watching Lost for the first time. Well, you should listen to the Rewatch Podcast, which is a rewatch podcast for the first season of Lost. In fact, tonight I'm doing a live version at the Cards Against Humanity office, in which we are going to watch the final episode, record an episode live, and I think stream it on the internet. You can come to that if you want to. There are free tickets. If you go to rewatchpodcast.com, you can show up to that show and hang out, drink beers, eat pizza, watch Lost, talk about Lost. So please do that if you are somehow watching this and are in the Chicagoland area. And we're going to do more Chicago events soon. I'm got some ideas forming, so stay tuned. I know I stay tuned for a couple of things lately, but I am thinking about that. But yeah, do listen to Rewatch Podcast. I think you'll get a lot more out of the season result. I think we did. I thought we had a lot of fun and provided a lot of insight into a spectacular show, and especially a spectacular first season. Otherwise, what would I recommend you do? I would look up Doc Jensen's write-ups from Entertainment Weekly. I think they're all archived on their website. I don't know how early he started his columns, but he used to do these amazing weekly columns where he would dissect the series and come up with all these wild fan theories. I don't know if Alan Sepinwall was doing Lost write-ups when the show was around, but if he was, you should go look them up. I wasn't reading them, but if he was doing them, you should read them, because I obsessively read Alan Sepinwall's write-ups for Game of Thrones and Mad Men and everything. He's a spectacular TV writer, so I would try and see if you can look up, I guess generally speaking, weekly columns that were analyzing the show at the time it was on, and see if you can follow along as you watch the episodes. That would be a lot of fun. Anonymous, how does it feel to be worse at video games than Mrs. Clip-Clop? He's referring to the Spelunky video, which you can go back and watch. It's listed as Spelunky Part 2. The reason it doesn't have fancy names is a YouTube thing we can talk about another time. But I think we're going to start doing a regular feature in which we try and get my wife to beat Yama. She's up for playing more Spelunky. She really enjoyed her first experience with it. So I think we're going to try and do one later this week in which we play the full version of Spelunky and get her into the jungle. And we'll see how far we can get her. Let's see if we can get her to defeat Yama. I mean, I think about what you have to do to defeat Yama with those bombs, and it terrifies me to watch her do that. But I think it would be a lot of fun to see how far we can get. So look forward to more episodes of that on Twitch and YouTube. And I think we're going to leave it there because I got to get going. I got to get ready for work. Got to walk my dog. That has been 3 Beers Deep. It is part of the Inventory Management podcast on iTunes, on which I throw up both this and other little audio things that I produce for work and for personal. If you want to ask questions in the future, go to patricklubbock.tumblr.com. I answer those on a daily basis and then pluck from there to answer questions here. If you don't use iTunes, you can go to inventorymanagement.simplecast.fm. You can stream episodes. You can download episodes. There's also an RSS link, so you can plug that into your podcast app of choice, whether that's on an iPhone or an Android or a Windows phone or whatever you got. You can get the episodes that I produce every single week in a variety of different ways. Don't have to use those Apple products if you don't like them. I like them, but you don't have to like them. That's fine. But I'll be back next Monday. Submit some more questions. I'll see you all next week.